Are you out of your mind? Unhand me!" The jagged shout shattered the sacred silence of the cathedral like a stone through a stained glass window. In an instant, the wedding of the century, a gathering of the city's most dangerous power players and glittering elite, transformed into a scene of utter chaos. 500 guests froze in their pews. At the altar, the most feared man in the state, Dominic "Dom" Moretti, was being physically seized. But it wasn't by an assassin or a rival boss. It was a girl in a sweat-stained neon orange delivery uniform. With her delivery cap pulled low over eyes burning with raw desperation, Tess Callahan didn't just touch him. She clamped a white-knuckled grip around Dom's wrist and yanked him toward the side vestry with a strength born of pure terror. Beside them, the bride, Camille Blackwood, stood like an ice statue in a $1,000,000 gown, her face contorting from shock to a murderous rage. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice piercing the incense-heavy air. "Get this filth out of here before I have her buried alive!" As black-suited guards surged forward like a pack of wolves, Tess didn't flinch. She leaned into the man who held the city in his palm and whispered words that stopped his heart. "I have a delivery for you, Mr. Moretti. The truth about why your wife is actually in a grave and why you're about to join her." The roar of the city never truly slept, and neither did Tess Callahan. 48 hours before she would stand trembling at the altar of St. Patrick's, Tess was just a blur of neon orange cutting through the midnight fog on a battered electric scooter. The wind whipped against her face, biting and cold, carrying the scent of exhaust and rain-slicked asphalt. Her hands, encased in fingerless gloves, were perpetually numb, but she couldn't afford to stop. Every delivery was another $15. Every $15 was a heartbeat for Tommy. She pulled up to a crumbling apartment complex on the edge of the South Side, the neon sign of a nearby liquor store flickering like a dying pulse. Tess adjusted the heavy thermal backpack that felt like a lead weight against her spine. She took a moment to check her phone, not for new orders, but for the alert from the hospital. The balance remained unchanged. $200,000. It was a number that felt more like a mountain, one she was trying to level with a plastic spoon. "Just a few more hours," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from the cold. When she finally climbed the 4 flights of stairs to their cramped studio, the air smelled of antiseptic and cheap radiator heat. Tommy was awake, propped up against a thin pillow, his face as pale as the moonlight filtering through the cracked window. At 16, he should have been out with friends, causing trouble, living. Instead, his world was a collection of pill bottles and a heart that hummed with a dangerous, irregular rhythm. "You're late, Tessie," he said, offering a weak, lopsided smile that broke her heart more than any insult ever could. "Big tips tonight," she lied, leaning down to press a kiss to his forehead. His skin was clammy. "The rich people are hungry. 1 more month of this, and we'll have enough for the specialist in New York, I promise." Tommy reached out, his thin hand gripping her orange sleeve. "You're exhausted. Your eyes are bloodshot. You're going to crash that bike if you don't sleep." "I'm a Callahan," she said, squaring her shoulders despite the ache in her bones. "We don't crash, we deliver." But as she stepped back into the hallway 5 minutes later, the bravado vanished. She slumped against the peeling wallpaper, closing her eyes for a fleeting second. She was a ghost in her own city, a girl in a polyester uniform that made her invisible to the world she served. She was nobody. But as she hopped back onto her scooter and saw a high-priority notification flash on her screen, a delivery to the Blackwood estate, she didn't know that her invisibility was about to end. She was about to deliver a truth that would set the city on fire. The high-priority notification on Tess's phone pulsed with an aggressive, rhythmic glow, lighting up the dark alley like a warning. The delivery address was for the Blackwood estate, a fortress of limestone and iron gates perched on the highest ridge of the city's affluent district. A priority drop usually meant a hefty tip, the kind that could cover Tommy's medication for a week. With a shaky breath, Tess kicked her scooter into gear, the small motor whining as she began the long climb away from the slums and toward the clouds. The estate was a monument to old money and cold secrets. As Tess buzzed the gate, a security camera swiveled toward her with a mechanical hiss. "Delivery for Miss Blackwood," she croaked into the intercom. The gates groaned open, admitting her into a world of manicured hedges and silent, looming statues. She pulled up to the service entrance, her orange uniform feeling like a neon target against the obsidian-colored stone of the mansion. A man in a sharp, dark suit met her at the door. He didn't speak. He simply thrust a small, bubble-wrapped envelope into her hands and barked, "This was supposed to go to the florist for the wedding centerpieces. It's late. Move." He slammed the door before Tess could even ask for a signature. She turned to leave, but as she reached her scooter, a sudden heavy rain began to fall, slicking the marble driveway. In her haste to tuck the package into her waterproof bag, her numb fingers betrayed her. The envelope hit the pavement, the adhesive seal, already dampened by the mist, snagging on the scooter's metal rack and tearing wide open. Tess froze. She knew the rule, never look inside, but as she reached down to retrieve the fallen item, it wasn't a set of floral instructions or a guest list that slid out onto the wet stone. It was a burner phone, its screen already lit up with an incoming text message that scrolled across the display in haunting clarity. "The dose is ready. He won't last through the honeymoon, just like the first one." Beneath the phone lay a small, crushed velvet pouch. As it tipped over, 2 clear glass vials spilled out, rolling toward the gutter. Tess's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This wasn't a delivery, it was a murder kit. Her eyes darted back to the phone, which began to play an audio file, a voice memo Camille Blackwood must have recorded as a draft. "Dom thinks he's untouchable, but by the time he realizes the arsenic is in his veins, I'll own the Moretti name. Isabel was easy. This will be easier." Tess felt the world tilt. She wasn't just a delivery girl anymore. She was a witness to a death sentence. And as a black SUV's headlights suddenly crested the driveway behind her, she realized the delivery was never meant to be seen by human eyes, and Camille Blackwood didn't leave witnesses alive. The heavy tires of the SUV crunched the gravel just yards away, but Tess didn't run. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the rain-slicked driveway as the audio on the burner phone continued to play, a ghostly confession cutting through the downpour. "Isabel was always too soft," Camille's voice crackled through the speaker, devoid of the honeyed charm she used in public. She thought being a Mafia wife meant playing house. She didn't realize that in this world, if you aren't the predator, you're the prey. Tess's breath hitched. Everyone in the city knew the story of Isabel Thorne, the beautiful, tragic first wife of Dominic Moretti, who had reportedly lost control of her car on a treacherous coastal road 2 years ago. The tragedy had turned the city's most powerful man into a hollow shell of ice. But the recording in Tess's hand told a far darker tale. "The brake lines were so easy to nip," Camille continued, followed by a low, chilling laugh. "The police saw a grieving socialite and a rainy night. They never looked for the girl who had spent the evening comforting the widower-to-be. Dom is so blinded by his own guilt that he'll never see the arsenic coming until his heart simply stops. By the time they autopsy him, the Blackwood name will be the only one left on the Moretti deeds." The headlights of the SUV swept over Tess, illuminating her orange uniform like a flare in the darkness. Panic finally broke her paralysis. She shoved the phone and the glass vials into her delivery bag, zipping it shut with trembling fingers. She didn't have time to mount the scooter. She dove into the shadow of a massive stone gargoyle just as the vehicle pulled to a stop exactly where she had been standing seconds before. From her hiding spot, Tess watched a man in a clinical white lab coat step out of the car. He looked around, his brow furrowed as he spotted the damp envelope lying abandoned on the pavement. He picked it up, his face hardening as he realized it was empty. Tess pressed her back against the cold stone, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would give her away. She wasn't just holding a delivery anymore. She was holding the ghost of a murdered woman and the life of a man she had only ever seen on the news. If Camille found out she had this phone, Tess wouldn't just lose her job. She and Tommy would become footnotes in the same bloody history book as Isabel Thorne. "Check the perimeter," the man barked into a radio. Tess didn't wait to hear the rest. Staying low, she began to crawl through the mud toward the dense tree line of the estate. She had to get to the city. She had to get to Tommy, and somehow she had to find a way to tell a king that his queen was a monster. Tess's scooter roared as she tore away from the Blackwood estate, the engine screaming in protest against the steep, rain-slicked incline. Her heart was a drum in her ears, drowning out the sound of the storm. She didn't look back, but she could feel the invisible threads of Camille Blackwood's power tightening around her already. She had to get to the city. She had to hide the phone. Back at the mansion, Camille Blackwood stood in the marble foyer, her silk robe fluttering as she paced like a caged leopard. The man in the white coat stood before her, head bowed. "The package is gone," he muttered. "The delivery girl. She saw everything." Camille didn't scream. She didn't throw a vase. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across her perfect, sculpted face. She picked up her own encrypted line and dialed a number that was never meant to be on public record. "Chief Miller," she said, her voice dropping into a practiced, trembling sob. "I need your help. One of those delivery people. She broke into my private study. She's been stalking my fiancé and me for weeks, and tonight she finally snapped. She stole a family heirloom, a diamond necklace worth $500,000, and a set of sensitive corporate files." She paused, listening to the frantic assurances on the other end. "She's dangerous, Chief. She was babbling something about Dominic's late wife. I think she's obsessed. Please, find her before she ruins the wedding. Her name is Tess Callahan. Yes, the girl in the orange vest. She's armed and unstable." As the call ended, Camille's eyes turned to Flint. "Alert the Moretti guards, too," she told her man. "Tell them a thief is trying to blackmail the family. If the police don't get her, I want our men to ensure she never speaks again." Miles away, Tess pulled into the neon-lit sanctuary of a 24-hour diner, her hands shaking so violently she could barely deploy the scooter's kickstand. She reached into her bag to check the burner phone, but before she could turn it on, the air was sliced by the sudden, piercing wail of a siren. 2 police cruisers rounded the corner, their blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement like blood. Over the loudspeaker, a voice boomed. "Tess Callahan, step away from the vehicle and put your hands behind your head. You are under arrest for grand larceny and felony stalking." Tess froze. The trap had snapped shut. In the eyes of the law, she wasn't a witness, she was a criminal. She looked at the diner, then at the dark alleyway beside it. If she surrendered now, the truth would die in a property locker. She thought of Tommy's pale face and Dom's unaware heart. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, she abandoned the scooter and vanished into the shadows just as the first officer's boots hit the ground. The shadows of the alley felt less like a sanctuary and more like a shroud. Tess pressed her back against a rusted dumpster, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that puffed white in the freezing air. Just 20 feet away, the street was a strobe light of blue and red, the siren's wail echoing off the brick walls like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands. They were stained with oil and road grit, trembling so violently she had to shove them into the pockets of her orange vest. Her scooter, her only lifeline to the world and her only way to reach Tommy, lay in a twisted heap of plastic and metal near the diner's entrance, crushed by the bumper of a surging patrol car. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was the symbol of her livelihood, now reduced to scrap. "Search every inch," a voice roared from the street. It wasn't the voice of a hero. It was the sharp, jagged tone of a man who took orders from the Blackwood payroll. "She's a thief, and she's dangerous. If she resists, don't hesitate." Tess squeezed her eyes shut. The weight of the burner phone in her pocket felt like a live grenade. She wasn't just hiding from the law. She could hear the low, heavy rumble of blacked-out SUVs circling the block. Moretti's men, the cleanup crew. They wouldn't bother with handcuffs or Miranda rights. A flashlight beam slizzed through the darkness, dancing across the rain-slicked pavement mere inches from her boots. Tess shrunk further into the crevice between the dumpster and the wall, the smell of rotting refuse and wet iron filling her lungs. Her mind raced to the hospital room where Tommy was waiting. If she was caught, there would be no surgery, no recovery, no big sister to tell him everything was going to be okay. She reached out and felt the cold, hard edge of a discarded lead pipe. For a moment, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage flickered through her fear. She was a Callahan. She had spent her life delivering through blizzards and heat waves, through hunger and exhaustion. She had been invisible for 26 years, but she wouldn't be silenced. The heavy thud of combat boots echoed at the mouth of the alley. A silhouette blocked the streetlights, a man in a dark suit, his hand reaching inside his jacket for something far more lethal than a badge. "I know you're in here, little bird," a man whispered, his voice dripping with a predatory calm. "Make it easy. Give me the phone, and maybe I'll let you say goodbye to your brother." Tess squeezed the burner phone. She realized then that there was no way out, not through the streets and not through the law. The only way forward was through the lion's den itself. She didn't need a scooter to reach the cathedral. She just needed to survive long enough to crash the only event Camille Blackwood couldn't hide from. With a desperate lunging movement, Tess scrambled toward a fire escape, her fingers clawing at the cold iron as she began to climb. While Tess was clawing her way up a frozen fire escape, the atmosphere inside the Blackwood bridal suite was one of suffocating elegance. The room smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax, a sanctuary of white silk that masked a rotting core. Camille Blackwood stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection a masterpiece of deceptive grace. She looked every bit the grieving widower's savior, but her hands were busy with a much darker task. Dominic sat on a velvet chaise lounge nearby, his head resting in his hands. The sharp jawline that usually commanded rooms was tight with a lingering phantom pain. He had been feeling off for weeks. The doctors called it grief-induced fatigue, but every morning the fog in his brain seemed to thicken. "You look tired, darling," Camille murmured, her voice like honey poured over glass. "The stress of the merger, the wedding, it's taking its toll." "I just can't shake the headache, Camille," Dom grunted, his voice raspier than usual. "It feels like my blood is made of lead." "I know. That's why I had the specialist prepare these." She reached for a crystal glass of water sitting on the vanity. Beside it sat a small, unmarked amber vial. With the practiced ease of a chemist, she uncorked it. Her eyes flitted toward the door, then back to the glass. 3 clear, odorless drops of arsenic fell into the water, the vitamin supplement she had been weaning him on for a month. It was a slow-motion execution, too little to kill him instantly, but enough to ensure his heart would falter during their honeymoon, leaving her as the sole heir to the Moretti empire before the ink on the marriage license was even dry. "Drink this," she said, stepping toward him and pressing the glass into his hand. Her fingers lingered on his, cold and steady. "It will clear the fog. I need you sharp when we stand before those 500 guests. I won't have people thinking the great Dominic Moretti is losing his edge." Dom looked up at her, his wide, stunned eyes searching hers for a comfort that wasn't there. He saw only the radiant bride. He didn't see the predator. He took a long, deep swallow, the poisoned water sliding down his throat as Camille watched with a faint predatory tilt of her head. "There," she whispered, taking the empty glass back. "In an hour the world will belong to the Morettis, and by tomorrow it will belong to me." She pressed a kiss to his forehead, a kiss that felt like the seal on a tombstone. As she turned back to the mirror to adjust her veil, she didn't know that miles away a girl in a bright orange vest was carrying the only antidote to her poison, the truth. Tess crouched in the skeletal framework of a half-finished high-rise, her lungs burning from the ascent. Below, the city was a grid of predatory lights. Every time a siren wailed in the distance, her heart stuttered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the burner phone, the screen cracked but still glowing like a dying ember. She had tried to call the precinct 3 times, but each time she saw a patrol car, she remembered the cold, transactional look in the eyes of the officers at the diner. Chief Miller was more than just a name on a payroll. He was Camille's personal shield. The law was a locked door, and Camille held the only key. Tess moved toward the back of the construction floor, where a small break room for the workers contained a battered television mounted to the wall. It was flickering with a live news feed. The headline scrolling across the bottom made her blood turn to ice. "Wedding of the Century, Dominic Moretti and Camille Blackwood to wed at St. Patrick's Cathedral." The reporter stood in front of the cathedral's massive oak doors, gushing about the ivory floral arrangements and the guest list of untouchables. A digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked forward with agonizing precision. 1 hour. In 60 minutes, Dominic Moretti would drink the final toast, exchange the final vow, and seal his fate. Tess looked at the burner phone, then at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the television. She was a mess of orange polyester and road grime, her face smeared with soot and tears. She looked exactly like the unstable stalker Camille had described. If she tried to go to the police now, she'd be processed and silenced before she could say a single word. If she stayed hidden, she'd be safe, but Dom would be dead by morning, and Camille would spend the rest of her life spending Moretti money while Tommy's hospital bills went unpaid. "I'm a delivery girl," she whispered, her voice cracking in the empty room. "I have a job to do." She didn't have a scooter, she didn't have a weapon, she didn't even have a plan that didn't end in her own death. But as she watched the motorcade of black SUVs begin to arrive at the church on the screen, a new kind of resolve hardened in her chest. She couldn't go to the authorities, and she couldn't run away. She had to go to the only person who had the power to stop the monster, the man who was about to marry her. Tess stood up, wiping the grime from her face with the back of her hand. She had 1 hour to cross 20 blocks of a city that was hunting her. She had 1 hour to deliver the truth. The golden spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral pierced the gray skyline, a monument to a union built on a foundation of corpses. Tess stood in the shadows of an alleyway 2 blocks away, her breath hitching as she looked down at the large, discarded cardboard box she had scavenged from a dumpster. Using a black marker found in the construction site, she had scrolled the words "urgent, floral replacement, altarpiece" in jagged, professional-looking block letters. She had shed her own grime-streaked orange vest, turning it inside out to hide the dirt, and pulled a spare, crumpled delivery cap low over her brow. She looked like a girl just doing her job, and in this city, that was the ultimate invisibility cloak. As she approached the outer perimeter, the air grew thick with the tension of high-level security. Black-clad men with earpieces and bulges beneath their suit jackets paced the sidewalk. Every guest was being scanned, every limousine searched. Tess felt the burner phone, the evidence that would either save her or get her killed, press hard against her hip. "Hey, you!" a guard barked, stepping into her path as she reached the side service entrance. Tess didn't stop. She kept her head down, her pace brisk and hurried, the heavy box balanced precariously on her shoulder to obscure her face. "Floral emergency," she snapped, her voice pitching into a tone of stressed, low-wage annoyance. "The bride's white lilies in the north transept are wilting. If these aren't at the altar in 5 minutes, it's my head and yours." The guard hesitated, his eyes darting from her orange-trimmed cap to the box. He reached for the cardboard, but Tess pulled back with a huff of indignation. "Careful! These are delicate. You want to be the one to tell Camille Blackwood why her wedding photos have brown petals in the background?" The mention of Camille's name acted like a curse. The guard's face paled. No one wanted to be the target of the future Mrs. Moretti's wrath. He stepped aside, waving her through the metal detector. "Make it fast. The ceremony starts in 10. The machine chirped, but the guard was already distracted by a congressman's arrival. Tess slipped through the heavy side door, the sudden transition from the cold wind to the warm, incense-heavy air of the cathedral making her dizzy. The muffled sound of the pipe organ began to vibrate through the floorboards, a low, ominous thrum that signaled the beginning of the end. She was inside the lion's den. She could see the back of the white pews, the sea of black tuxedos, and the distant shimmering figure of Dominic Moretti standing at the altar. She was feet away from the most dangerous men in the country, with nothing but a cardboard box and a dying phone to protect her. But as she moved deeper into the shadows of the stone pillars, Tess knew the delivery was almost complete. The scent of lilies and expensive incense hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that made Tess's stomach churn. From the deep shadows of the rear stone pillars, she watched the scene unfold with a sense of mounting dread. The cathedral was a sea of black silk and polished diamonds, an assembly of the city's most dangerous predators gathered to witness a union of blood and power. At the far end of the long, velvet-shrouded aisle, Dominic Moretti stood like a statue carved from obsidian. Even from this distance, Tess could see the slight sway in his shoulders, the way he leaned imperceptibly against the marble altar for support. The arsenic was doing its work. Beside him, Camille was a vision of lethal perfection, her lace veil trailing behind her like a funeral shroud. The pipe organ swelled, the deep vibrating notes rattling the very bones in Tess's chest. The priest raised his hands, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling as he began the ancient liturgy. Every word felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. The guests leaned forward, their faces etched with a reverence that was entirely unearned. They were celebrating a murder in progress, and they didn't even know it. Tess looked down at the burner phone in her hand. The battery icon was a thin red sliver, a flickering ghost of life. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic plea for her to run, to hide, to survive. She thought of Tommy, alone in that sterile hospital bed, and then she looked back at Dom. He was a man who had lost everything once before, and now he was handing his life to the woman who had taken it. "We are gathered here today," the priest's voice boomed, "to join this man and this woman in the sacred bonds of holy matrimony." Tess stepped out from behind the pillar. The bright orange of her delivery cap felt like a scream in the middle of a prayer. She took the first step, her heavy boots thudding against the marble floor. No one noticed her yet. All eyes were fixed on the golden couple at the front. She took another step, then another. The aisle seemed to stretch for miles, a gauntlet of power and prejudice. She was a delivery girl, a nobody, a ghost in a polyester uniform. But as she saw Camille reach out to take Dom's hand, the hand that was trembling with the first signs of paralysis, Tess stopped being afraid. She didn't have a weapon, and she didn't have a badge. She only had the truth, and she was going to deliver it if it was the last thing she ever did. If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be wed, the priest intoned, the traditional pause hanging in the air like a bated breath. Tess didn't wait. She broke into a run. The heavy oak doors slammed against the stone walls with a thunderous crack that echoed like a gunshot. Before the elite guests could gasp, before the armed security could draw their weapons, a blur of neon orange tore through the center of the cathedral. Tess Callahan didn't stop until she reached the altar, her heavy boots skidding on the polished marble. The wedding of the century died in a heartbeat. "Are you insane? Let go of me!" Dominic's voice was a jagged rasp, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and the clouded confusion of the poison. But Tess didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers white-knuckled and desperate, and clamped onto his wrist. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she yanked the most feared man in the city 3 feet forward, pulling him out of his sacred alignment with the bride. Camille Blackwood froze, her face contorting from a mask of bridal purity into a jagged snarl of predatory rage. "Security! Drag this filth out of here!" she shrieked, her voice piercing the incense-heavy air. "She's a lunatic, a stalker! Kill her if you have to!" Black-suited guards surged forward from the transepts like a pack of wolves, their hands reaching for their holsters. But Tess ignored the barrels of the guns. She ignored the 500 witnesses. She reached into her delivery bag and pulled out the cracked burner phone, thrusting it inches from Dominic's face. "Look at it, Dominic," she screamed over Camille's hysterics. "Look at the screen. She didn't just kill Isabel. She's killing you right now." The mention of Isabel acted like a physical blow. Dom's icy gray eyes cleared for a fleeting second, locking on to the scrolling text on the burner phone. He saw the messages. He saw the chemical names. He saw his own death warrant. "Liars! It's a fake!" Camille lunged forward, her elegant lace sleeves fluttering like the wings of a vulture. She reached for the phone, her manicured nails clawing to snatch the evidence and smash it against the marble floor. "Give me that, you little rat!" Tess spun away, shielding the phone with her body as a guard's hand gripped her shoulder. She threw the phone at Dom's chest. "Play the audio! Play the memo from last night!" Dom caught the device with a reflex that defied his weakened state. He hit the play button. Camille's voice, cold and mocking, began to fill the hallowed silence of the cathedral. "Dom is so blinded by his own guilt that he'll never see the arsenic coming." The guards froze. The guests stood paralyzed. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than the stone of the cathedral itself. Dominic Moretti slowly turned his head toward his bride, his expression shifting from shock to a terrifying, lethal clarity. The predator had finally seen the trap, and the delivery girl was the only one left standing between him and the grave. The recording of Camille's voice faded into the vaulted ceiling, leaving a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Dominic stood motionless, the burner phone trembling in his grip. The arsenic fog in his brain seemed to part for a split second, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that cut deeper than any blade. He ignored the gasps of the socialites and the confused murmurs of the underworld dons. His thumb hovered over the cracked screen, finding a hidden video file dated the night of Isabel's death. He pressed play. The footage was grainy, taken from a dash cam that had been wiped from the official police record. It showed Isabel's car swerving violently, the headlights cutting through a rainstorm, just like the one currently raging outside. But it wasn't a mechanical failure. A second car, Camille's sleek silver coupe, was visible in the frame, repeatedly ramming Isabel's bumper, forcing her toward the jagged edge of the cliff. The video ended with a sickening crunch of metal and a scream that had haunted Dominic's dreams for 2 years. Dominic's knees buckled. The man who had built an empire on iron and blood sank onto the marble step of the altar. The ice boss was gone. In his place was a man whose soul had been systematically dismantled by the woman standing in white silk beside him. A single jagged sob escaped his throat, a sound of raw, unvarnished agony that shocked the room more than the interruption ever could. He looked up at Camille, his gray eyes no longer cold, but burning with a terrifying hollow light. He saw her now, not as his savior, but as the vulture who had picked at his heart while he was still alive. He realized with a jolt of horror that every kiss, every vitamin she had pressed into his hand, and every word of comfort had been a step toward his own grave. He had almost handed the keys to his world to the person who had murdered the only woman he ever loved. "You," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of a death sentence. Camille stepped back, her heels clicking sharply on the stone. The mask of the grieving bride had shattered, leaving behind the frantic, ugly face of a trapped animal. "Dom, listen to me. It's a fabrication. That girl, she's a professional. She's working for your enemies." Dominic didn't listen. He turned his gaze to Tess, who stood a few feet away, her orange uniform torn and her chest heaving. She was a stranger, a girl he had seen as nothing more than a ghost in the hallway, yet she was the only person in the world who had cared enough to save him. For the first time in his life, the powerful Mafia boss reached out a hand not to strike, but to steady himself against the girl who had delivered the truth. The ice had finally broken, and beneath it was a man ready for vengeance. The chaos of the cathedral dissolved into a blur of flashing rites and low-voiced commands. As Dominic's men surrounded Camille, stripping the diamond-encrusted veil from her head with as much reverence as they would a discarded rag, she finally broke. Her screams of innocence turned into venomous curses, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings until the heavy oak doors closed behind her, silencing the monster forever. The wedding of the century was over, but for Dominic Moretti, the world was finally coming into focus. 2 hours later, the sterile white hallway of the city hospital felt quieter than the church. Dominic stood outside the surgical theater, his tailored black suit jacket abandoned, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink on his arms. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had narrowly escaped a shipwreck. Through the glass window of the waiting room, he saw her. Tess sat in a plastic chair, her bright orange delivery cap clutched in her lap. She looked small against the vastness of the hospital, her shoulders slumped with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. When she saw him, she started to rise, but he held up a hand, stepping into the room with a softness that no one in the underworld would have recognized. "The surgeons just took her back," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the vending machines. They said because of the deposit, they could start immediately. Who did that, Mr. Moretti?" Dominic sat in the chair beside her, the powerful boss and the delivery girl finally on level ground. "I have a lot of debts, Tess," he said, his voice thick with a genuine emotion that cracked his icy exterior. "But the one I owe you, I can never fully repay. You didn't just deliver a phone. You delivered me from a grave I was digging for myself." He looked at the orange uniform, once a symbol of her invisibility, and saw it now as the armor of a hero. He realized then that while he had been surrounded by loyal soldiers and high society allies, it was a stranger with nothing to gain who had risked everything to save his life. She had seen the man behind the shadow, and in doing so, she had saved his soul. "Tommy's going to be okay," Dominic promised, reaching out to cover her hand with his. It wasn't the grip of a boss, but a silent vow of protection. "From now on, you don't have to deliver anything ever again, except perhaps a chance for us both to start over." Tess leaned her head back against the wall, a single tear tracking through the grime on her cheek. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running, wasn't hiding, and wasn't invisible. The delivery was complete, and as the in-surgery light flickered above the door, a new story was just beginning.